As you already know, these are strange times, extremely trying times for the safety of lives and properties in Africa. Not only because, of course, as we know, the outbreak of COVID-19, but also because of the increasing cases of extreme poverty, cyber theft, food insecurity, especially with the recent effects of climate change on agriculture, among many other undeniable realities across Africa. And today we are pleased to have with us Tyrus Muya Kamau, a Kenyan security analyst and principal consultant at Euclid Consultancy, South African journalist Phumlani Majozi, also a senior fellow at African Liberty, and Patrick Stephenson, head of research at IMANI Africa, one of the continent's most influential and respected think tanks. Gentlemen and ladies, thanks for joining us for this discussion. Of course, to start with, I would like to, first of all, ask about, what's actually going on with the newest security challenge in Africa, the outbreak of COVID-19, coronavirus disease. And I would like to know from Phumlani, I think we saw the first case in Nigeria, but afterward it became sort of a continental issue after South Africa recorded its first case. So what's actually going on in your country right now?
Well, remember, South Africa is, firstly, thanks for inviting me, Ibrahim, and it's great to join fellow panelists. South Africa right now is on the lockdown, right? So the president this week he came out and said that the country will be locked down for about 21 days for the purposes of trying to contain the spread of the virus. South Africa is right now the leading country in terms of confirmed cases or infections, as they call it. Where we are right now, we seem to be, taking a route where things are rising quite fast in terms of infections. And this week, there was only one case where one person passed or died out of all these confirmed cases that we've been hearing about. So the atmosphere is quite dull. People have, because of the lockdown, they are back into their houses. They've withdrawn to their houses because it's against the law to be out there doing whatever you want. That's what government has said. The situation is dull, and people are there's a sense of fear, apprehension as well. People ask themselves, am I going to contract this? What happens to me? What could happen to members of my family? And that fear is not only in people in general. It's also in the market as well. We've been seeing how the market has been doing globally, even here in South Africa as well. Huge sell-offs at Johannesburg Stock Exchange. So this investment is quite big. So that's the kind of from an atmosphere perspective where we are. And the second part of your question or comment was about how has government handled this. Firstly, there's been many concerns that the government should have never let this happen in the first place, because this thing began in Asia. In Asia, and we saw how numbers were rising quite quickly. We saw the speed of infections. We saw this thing moving to Europe, Italy, that at one point became the epicenter of the disease. So we could have taken precautions way early in terms of making sure that whoever comes into the country gets screened as thoroughly as possible. And that didn't happen up until we're at a point where at least a case or a few cases had been confirmed. That's where we saw government taking concrete step to try now and to address this issue. There have been a number of things that have been done. The first one, from a fiscal point of view, fiscal policy that is from government. We have seen announcements of tax breaks. We have seen solidarity funds being started. The Oppenheimers and the Rupert family, they put in billions into helping small businesses and so on. That's the fiscal side. And remember, the problem we have in South Africa on the fiscal side is that we are already indebted. So we don't have the money that we see, for example, the US this week signing $2 trillion of fiscal relief. So there's no money to finance these things. So government is looking at small things like tax breaks and so on. So that's the fiscal side. On a monetary point of view, the South African Reserve Bank, what they've done is that they cut the rates, which was quite aggressive in years. They cut the rates by the benchmark rate by 1%. This week, they pushed even more in terms of loosening the monetary policy by buying government bonds. So we are seeing those responses from government. And my sort of argument, Ibrahim, has been that I doubt that will make much impact. Because remember, South Africa's economy was already in a recession before COVID-19 hit this country because of state-owned enterprises where government had totally failed, high unemployment rate that was never stopping, from coming down. We're seeing deficits going up and up. We are spending beyond what we can afford. Economic growth was, projected to be less than 1%, so we are not getting out of that mess. So you can't now think that all those things by dishing out money when the problems we have are structural. Structural in the sense that we need to see government pulling back from intervening in the economy. We need to see relaxed labor policies. We need to see proper education being put in place to bring confidence into the economy.
Absolutely.
So I doubt these things are going to make a difference. Well, they say lose money is not bad, but if people are locked down into houses and there's no demand, there's no supply because the whole economy has been disrupted, with these aggressive monetary and fiscal policies, we are seeing nothing much is going to happen.
Unfortunately, bro, I share your concerns, and I'm still going to come back to you as regards the role of the private sector. We've seen government play a lot of roles in the last couple of decades. Is that it hasn't helped at all. So I just want to go to Mr. Patrick in Ghana right now, and I know you guys are at the forefront of the policy side to addressing this outbreak. So, Mr. Patrick, what can you tell us about what the Ghanaian government is doing? Are they doing quite enough? Are you safe? And what do you suggest moving forward in handling COVID-19 outbreak in your country?
Like most of the governments you're finding on the African continent today, claims to be trying its best or doing, what it can as far as its capacities are concerned. The question which you ask is whether or not, these initiatives are themselves sufficient. And on that score, I think the evidence truly is mixed. And the reason it's mixed is because I look at this from three perspectives, right? First, what has, the sort of financial support or financial strategies for dealing with the crisis itself? What have these strategies look like? We equally look at what has been happening on the economy side of things, strategies that are being deployed from a health and safety and an operational point of view. In all cases, you find some of the strategies not being coherently thought through. Because if you take, for example, on the economy side of things, I mean, the projections are that the economy is going to slow down drastically, and we have projections 6.8%. Now it's been slashed all the way to 2.5%. Now that has a number of implications, not least of which is that already we're seeing tumbling of crude oil. In growth like that for us means the government is not going to be able to raise significant revenues that it typically anticipates. There's a number of things. And for a government that has consistently driven its presence in private operations, that is very worrying. Because then the only way they see this is not a collaborative engagement with the private sector, but for the government to go and raise crazy amounts of money either from the financial markets, which will end up crowding out private sector initiatives. And so that is a very worrying development. However, what those of us on the right thinking side of economic policy would tend to agree with, there's been a significant cut in taxes. For example, monetary policy has loosened up. They've reduced monetary policy by 150 basis points. We have been calling for a reduction in that for some time now. Just yesterday, the president, at about 11 p.m., addressed the country again, and he outlined quite a number of initiatives that the government is working around. What I'm not too comfortable with the states leading the setup of this stimulus fund, which nobody seems to know where the resources are going to come from, but somehow it's going to be directed by the state. I think that what you want to see at a point like this is for the states to recognize what sort of initiative private capital is putting up, or what sort of initiative private people are putting up to solving the problems, and create an environment. But when the state itself jumps in, without recourse to what private businesses are doing, without recourse to what private healthcare solutions are doing, so it can coherently put these together, then we are beginning to worry. On the technical and operational side of things, again, the argument has been that our government has been very slow because they put together a restriction, if you like, on the movement of people not too long ago. And since then, the number of people that have been able to get into the country who have not even been checked properly are nearly 30,000. Now, that in itself is worrying. If we haven't been able to get that technical operations right, what justification do we have to pass an executive instrument like what we saw on the 23rd of March, which practically mandates all telecom companies in this country to submit private conversations and phone call data, cell site data, everything to the state? These are the conversations that are missing from the real policy debate. So that, yes, it's a crisis that we are confronted with, but in an attempt to deal with it, we are not trying to understand what private solutions truly exist and how the state can complement that, but we are almost using the state to usurp civil liberties. I would think that that is very worrying, because you may deal with the problem COVID-19 today, but the damage to civil liberties and our inability to reverse them will be permanent and may damage the democracy of this country. And so if you ask me whether I'm safe, yes, today I'm safe. I'm home. I'm having a very nice conversation with you and my colleagues from the other countries. But tomorrow, I can't tell you if this conversation is not a conversation that the state is privy to. I can't tell you. I can't be sure if I am free as a person and a participant in this economy that the state is not spying on me and necessarily using that data for somebody else. So I think that it's important we start evaluating the strategies from the economy side, operational side, and financial commitments that have been made.
And I agree with you. Solution is key. Solution is really key. I agree with what you said. Sorry to cut you short, but I'm going to come back to you later, Mr. Patrick. What I was going to ask Mr. Tyrus from Kenya, I believe, is the question, of course, that you raised about overbloating of bureaucracies and, you know, governments overreaching their legal boundaries. And of course, we're suffering from the same problem in the United States, where, you know, a lot of state governments and local governments are using the state of emergency to, you know, change some rules and overreach individual liberties. But Mr. Tyrus, you're in Kenya. So what has been the response in Kenya? Are you safe? And what is the Kenyan government doing that you think is better, or things that it can do better to manage the COVID-19 outbreak?
I really appreciate being part of this panel, and it's a pleasure meeting the rest of the panelists. So in Kenya, Nairobi, the capital where I am, we've actually, as of 24 hours ago, the government instituted 9-hour or 10-hour curfew, meaning that there shouldn't be a single person in the streets from 7, that's within the next 20 minutes, till 5 a.m. Unless you're providing what are known as essential services. So unless you're in the medical field, national security, food and retail. And yesterday it was really chaotic and very unfortunate because, as you can imagine, people are rushing to get home. And our public transport is not the best in the world. So there are very few resources. And we saw scenes where people were being clobbered, you know, and there was a running joke that it's not the COVID-19 virus that is going to kill people in Kenya, it's actually the police. So you see here, we have a case where civil liberties have been infringed upon, and you know, they'll come out and say that, you know, they're going to investigate these cases and everything. But then again, it's really, you know, being poor in Kenya and in most African countries, I believe, is more is almost making you an enemy of the state, because you really don't have much of a choice. And whereas you have, you know, people in government and the upper middle class who are privileged to probably be at home, they're probably working from home. We have people who are living hand to mouth. So we've seen a bit of an intrusion into civil liberties. The other thing that has happened is that there has been 30-day lockdown in the country, so which means most people have to work from home, as is with Ghana and South Africa. And we've also seen a reduction in tax, especially for commodities, starting the 1st of April. So there was a bill that was passed in Parliament by our members of Parliament about 2-3 days ago. So try and ease the burden. What you're also seeing is that the communications companies, so the mobile network operators, have also reduced the tariffs for either sending money, which is really big here in Kenya, and also, you know, doubled the bandwidth for those who can afford the internet. So these are some of the measures that have been taken into consideration to try and ease the burden onto the citizenry. as far as this particular pandemic is concerned. So one other thing that we're seeing is that there are instances where now all of a sudden the government has resources to provide to its citizenry. For instance, we're finding that areas that normally on a normal day would not have water, all of a sudden there's water. We're also finding instances where resources are being availed, especially in the slums, in the poverty-stricken areas. And that begs the question that really, does it take a pandemic for governments to wake up? It has really exposed the soft underbelly of these institutions where we vote in politicians and they just come and sell hot air to us and we buy into it. But then in the event of a pandemic, no one is spared, right? Because here we have politicians already infected. One of them was actually, he's pending prosecution because he knowingly knew that he was exposed to COVID-19 and he's on quarantine at the moment. And the moment he's out, he's going to be prosecuted because he knew he went for a burial, he attended a political rally, he went to a hotel, and that led to an explosion of this spread of the pandemic. Currently, as of today, we have 38 confirmed cases and one unfortunate death, which happened yesterday, and about 700 to 900 potential cases that are still being tested. So I'd say that the scene or the scenario is more or less the same across the board in Africa. And I think these are some of the challenges that we are seeing are different from how the rest of the world is handling this particular pandemic. Case in point is that you'll see places like Singapore, they really stemmed down this pandemic by consistent testing. Africa, we are lagging behind because first of all, we are waiting on the goodwill of say Jack Ma to send us testing kits. We're waiting for the Chinese to send us the testing kits, which unfortunately, when they get to Africa, they go to the government officials, as I heard it was the case in Nigeria, which is rather unfortunate. So this really leaves us very exposed and wondering, are these the same people who, will send out there to represent our interests? And it really begs the question for young people like us, when we get into government, the day we get into government, what would be different about us? Because I think there's always that catch-22 of, you want to make the change, but you can't change the system from the outside. You need to get into the inside, but the minute you get into the inside, then the system just consumes you. So I think these are some of the things that I feel are a threat to just not our national securities, but also as a continent. These are some of the things that we probably need to address.
So I want to ask, Mayowa, what's going on in Ibadan or Nigeria generally? How's the government handling it? And are you guys also witnessing the use of civil liberties as some of our colleagues across Africa are witnessing, or is the Nigerian government actually leading the way for the rest of the continent to emulate? Mayowa?
Nigerian government leading the way. That's something that you would not expect anytime soon. It's laughable. So there have been several approaches by several states. So the response is not unified. And to a great extent, we haven't really seen serious clampdown on freedom of expression or civil liberties so far, but we are going to get there. The government over the last...
Did you just say we are going to get there?
We are going to get there.
You're not even optimistic.
We understand the system. We know how Nigeria works. The thing is that the number of cases it's less than 100. It's about, the last count is about 61 thereabouts, right? So they haven't gotten into panic mode yet. Some states have. Some states like Kaduna State have been taking proactive measures and advising people to stay indoors. So far, the approach has been advisory, telling people to, we advise you to stay indoors. However, increasingly by the day, you would see that what I expect that the government will begin to take a lot more forceful approach to getting people to stay indoors. Oyo State, where I stay, has advised that from tomorrow, everyone should stay indoors. Both government parastatals, government workers were told to not come to work from last week, but now this is extending to people in the private sector. Over the last couple of weeks, private businesses were still open. But as the number increases significantly, but would see a lot more forceful enforcement of this. People should stay indoors. But as my friend from Kenya mentioned, one of the problems we are going to see, or what we've already started seeing, is that poor people are going to be are going to be burnt from this. For example, you see that the testing kits that came into the country a couple of days ago were immediately distributed to the connected, to the privileged, to the people in politics, people who have connections to politicians, at the detriment of everybody else. Yesterday, Davido, the musician, announced that his girlfriend, tested positive to COVID-19, and he tested 31 people from his crew. So these are 31 people without symptoms who had access to testing materials, testing kits, got tested, whereas there are people who traveled from UK who showed symptoms and haven't been able to get tested. It just shows how people can, people with access to power would, they're the ones who are getting tested. Someone was having a conversation with me yesterday and saying, look, what they've seen is a trend that only the people who are testing positive to the coronavirus are people who are well placed in society. And I said, no, I don't think that's true. What we are saying is that those who are testing positive are connected people because they're the ones who have access to testing kits. There are people who don't have access to testing kits who are most likely infected at the moment, right? So, but because they cannot get tested, we do not know that they have the virus, right? So while it might seem like those who are being announced, who are coming on social media to say, I tested positive, whatever, are people who are highly placed, who are connected. It's not the reality of the situation. They are the ones who have access to the testing kits. That's why it seems that way. Unfortunately, this is not going to change anytime soon, right? Whether if you are not connected, if you do not have access to, these highly placed politicians, and you have the symptoms, too bad for you.
Away from the coronavirus problem to an equally serious problem in Africa right now. I don't know if I can call it outbreak 2 or infestation of farmlands in East Africa by locusts. And of course, this is a direct consequence of the effect of climate change. We know that was going to happen. We always know that there will be typhoons and the rivers are going to get flooded at some point. And we're going to have this, pests attacking our food, our farmlands across Africa. But the question is, the African government didn't prepare for it. And instead of the Kenyan government, the Tanzanian government to be providing farmers with ready-made solutions, they seems to be lost. So I want to go to you, Mr. Kamau. I know you are in Kenya, and East Africa is one of the most affected when it comes to climate change and the locust infestation. I want to ask, do you think the approach by the government of, attacking a problem as soon as it emanates in Africa is the actual way to go in addressing many of our security challenges, especially when it concerns food? Or do we need to have ready-made solution? And if at all we do, what are those ready-made solutions to addressing food security and agricultural problems?
So you've asked a very pertinent question, which, as you rightly put it, recently we've had locust infestations. And again, our government was caught flat-footed, and it's no surprise. And they don't know how to deal with this pestilence. Yet we have whole institutes of research, agricultural research, and institutions that are charged with doing R&D as far as projecting and also predicting in the event these sort of calamities happen, what do we do? Now, the one thing that I've seen over the years, and again, it just spans across Africa, is that you find that food security is always a campaign item, where you find that right from the top to the governors to your local leaders, they'll always play this card, and they'll always say that, you know what, you vote for me, we'll come with farming subsidies like the case we have in Nigeria, and we'll come up with cheaper feeds for you to plant. We'll set up institutes and research and extension officers to come and help you. But then again, once they're elected, then that's it. So you find our people are continuously languishing in poverty, and they're not well fed. In the event of drought, again, they just keep on getting emaciated. But then again, on the flip side of it, we find that there are a lot of international organizations that have crept into Africa to bring agricultural solutions, which I find very ironic, because I don't think it should take a Dutch person to come to Africa and tell us how it is that we need to produce our food. I mean, this has been our breadbasket since our ancestors. So then that again becomes a conduit for our leaders to try and extort and then get as much brown envelopes pushed towards them. And at the same time, I find that even as much as our agricultural institutions are teaching graduates how to go out there and develop drought-resistant crops, artificial insemination, bettering the breeds and building more resilient breeds, I find that we, even as Africans, we really don't appreciate what goes into farming, because most of us, once we're done with school, we just want to sit in an office. And you see now that again becomes a challenge, because then who leaves food? Who do we leave food production to? We leave it to the poor farmer who's struggling not only to produce food, but also to feed his own family and also educate his own family. And that also now puts us at the crosshairs of, should a disaster come? And I'm always very thankful that our continent is always shielded from natural disasters such as earthquakes and typhoons and cyclones and things like that. And I'm always shuddering to think that we live in one of the most beautiful continents in the world. It's a tropical climate. And I was making a joke to a friend of mine. I once visited Netherlands and I saw how they really struggle with flooding, but again, they're self-sufficient. And it's because if you throw an African out of the streets, he'll never go hungry. He'll always find something to eat. He can go to the neighbors and he can pick corn, he can pick cassava, he can pick a sweet potato, and he'll be fed for a day. So we are really not challenged by the forces of nature to be self-sufficient as far as food is concerned. Yet we know that, and look, we're having the locust infestation, which is really getting blindsided by the coronavirus. We don't know the damage of the extent so far. We are yet to find out. And I gather this is going to go on for a couple of months. So we really don't know the reality of what happens now to the next harvest. So I feel that there's really not much being done in this country as far as food security is concerned. And even the people who are being put in charge are really not taking into consideration that food in itself is, for me, it's not just food security, but food is actually national security. Because you are hungry, and they always say that when the poor get tired, the first people to be eaten will be the rich.
Absolutely correct. So, Mr. Patrick, I want to come to you real quick. And this is about not only the responsibility of state government or national government, whichever you want to call it, but what can a multinational organization, political multinationals like ECOWAS, EAC, and SADC, how can they help in in assisting, state governments or ordinary Africans in addressing these two key security problems, the locust infestation or the effect of climate change and the management of COVID-19? First of all, because we haven't really seen too much from ECOWAS, SADC, or EAC as regards to addressing COVID-19. And also, we got to talk about the food security too. So what do you think should be the role of these regional multinational organizations in addressing these two very pertinent security problems in Africa?
I think that the ethos of these, if you like, regional bodies and regional institutions somewhat has been lost, right? When it comes to the provision of the right safety nets that the people of Africa truly need when it comes to the two fundamental issues you've talked about. And COVID-19, we shouldn't just limit the conversation to COVID-19. I think that if we had properly defined health infrastructure systems across Africa, and, political officials in Africa didn't have the opportunity of flying to Europe and the US to go and in some parts of Asia to get healthcare, maybe we wouldn't be having this conversation at all. So let's not limit the conversation of COVID. We have health and safety and health and provision issues. You have sustainability of food production, which are two fundamental issues, I think. And I think that the bodies you're talking about, I think they've been caught behind the ball. And again, it's typical of political organizations, right? And so what have they done? I think the biological construct, these are institutions that we thought will agree on what needs to be done on a regional level, then individual countries are going to take up. But then it's years now, it's been shown that level of thinking, where there appears to be some group of people who we think will have superior knowledge about how a particular phenomenon must evolve or occur in a particular country or locale, I think that position has been disproven over time. What these institutions truly need to do is to learn from localized solutions and then have representation at these localized solution level that feeds back into policy design at the regional level. And I think that in the absence of that coherent thinking, we've always run into complications where when we have to put together strategies on even security, as it were, national security, for example, we've had political differences, which has made it very difficult for localization of solutions. So if I will give you a typical example, Ghana may go sit at ECOWAS, agree on something that is an agricultural produce, a movement of goods across the border between Ghana, Togo, Nigeria, and Benin. But we come home, and then because of the perverse political incentives we have in the country, they decide not to abide by that treaty. And so that almost undermines what we want to do at the regional level. So for me, I think that we're at a point where the regionalization is excellent. We need to find a way by which we get things done together. But more concretely, on those two issues, one, I think we need better leadership from ECOWAS, to be very honest. And that leadership will then mean that the individual solutions that we're seeing in places like Nigeria, places like Ghana, if these solutions work, then it gives the regional body something to think about. But if we're expecting the regional body to sort of define this framework, none of our governments are obliged to. I mean, at best, you're going to get a set of recommendations that the individual countries have got to follow. And if the political narratives in those countries do not support these directives, you usually run into complications. So that's issue number one. Number two, I think that, again, on health and safety issues, if you look at the strategies that were deployed when we had the Ebola outbreak, I think there was a much robust leadership around that, even though we ended up with a lot of casualties, which borders down ultimately to the investments that we're making in healthcare infrastructure across the continent of Africa. I think that there appeared to be some coherent thinking, right from the West all the way from the African Union itself to ECOWAS. I don't see that kind of leadership now. And you can understand why. I mean, if some of the big players and some of the regional blocks have not pulled their weight or haven't found a way of navigating that, South Africa is struggling now. If you look at Ghana, we're in a mess. If you take Nigeria, so who's going to take leadership if you take ECOWAS as a block, for example? And that is essentially required. Regarding agriculture, I think that it's a no-brainer, truly. If you are in Africa and somehow you haven't seen the evolution of developments in the environment, and that supports food production and food security issues. We are the largest population that are young, largest population that are ostensibly investing and working in the agricultural sector, but somehow we can't produce the food that we need. I mean, if you take some of the countries in the West, you have countries with population, labor market population that's just about 3%. That are in agriculture, but they provide the food they need and export to Africa, where you may get, in some cases, in my case, you have nearly 60% of the population working in agriculture. I think the solution for that at a regional level is that we have to start seeing agriculture as a commercial activity. For a very long time, land tenure systems have defined agricultural systems in Africa as, living subsistently. So what that has meant is that investments in proper systems and structures that ensures that we actively and accurately monitor developments around climate change, for example. We're not doing that. Again, I'm going to use Ghana as an example. The entire food basket of the country towards the north is what grows food for the country. Somehow, food is produced without proper technological systems that monitor and connect access to market. And so 30,000 farmers can grow tomatoes and the tomatoes goes to waste. And then we have to go all the way to Burkina Faso and in Brazil to import tomatoes. Doesn't make any sense. So we live in an era where there's sufficient technology that if we start thinking around agriculture as a commercial activity, it will require a number of things. One, a re-engineering of land tenure systems and protection of protection of property, landed property for commercial agricultural development. It will mean that reducing the level of influence that the states have in commercial activity and providing the incentives that commercial agriculture requires. Commercial agriculture will always find ways to provide what the people are looking for. And right from the regional level, you get the thinking that they want to do this. But at the national level, most countries still have governments that are heavily involved, and then the perverse political incentives almost derive the supposed benefits that should come out of that. Look across the continent today, again, on the regional blocks, some of the industries are going to start doing well are being driven purely by private capital, right? And so you see things like mining, you see things like the mining, oil and gas industry, you see things like telecom, you see things like finance and banking. Yes, you may have a few state interventions in there, or state institutions in there, but majority of that initiative is driven by private capital. Somehow when it comes to agriculture, we have significant interest of the state that, in my opinion, the negative political incentives that some make commercial businesses there viable over time. I can't pick any commercial agricultural business in Ghana today that is more than 40 years old. None, zero. Why? Because they start up, we have the perverse political incentives that almost writes it off. So if you go back to the regional level, I'm not sure what the experiences in Nigeria, what the experiences in Cote d'Ivoire, or the experiences in Kenya and South Africa may look like. But we have land administration systems, for example, from the eastern all the way to the southern part of the continent, that for a very long time have not necessarily supported, commercial development of agriculture to the extent that provides security for citizens. So the AU can sit and talk about Agenda 2063, let's dream 50 years from today. If we're not solving today's problems today, there is absolutely no way we are getting anywhere. And so I think that we need coherence in thinking, we need evidence from ground up of exactly what localized solutions look like, and provide an ecosystem that supports these localized solutions to provide food for people that live in these areas, and stop this thinking of short-term economic rationale, which almost always is eaten away by the political narrative.
A very fascinating data on South Africa that your country, unfortunately, has about 40% of its population in poverty, living below the poverty line. That's about 13.8 million South Africans. That's a very surprising figure. So we know that it's extremely big number, 13.8 million. Wow, that's really big. Addressing this from the perspective of the SADC, how do you think this regional organization of body has been able to help, governmental organizations or state government per se in addressing these challenges? Or how do you think they can come into play? One, and on the other hand, do you see any room for private sector to addressing this problem of food security in Southern Africa generally?
It's very important to understand. I think Patrick puts it correctly. I think he's on point. It's very important to understand that SADC is a group of politicians. Right. So if it's politicians, it means that these are people we vote for from different countries who collaborate from a regional point of view to address the challenges that we face. And we as classical liberals here, or libertarians, some of us in this group, we do believe that the role of the state or the role of politicians in an economy is to create an environment where the private sector can thrive, right? Private sector can be able to create jobs. The private sector can be allowed to pursue innovation, allowed to create jobs. So that's the role of the state. It's not to control agriculture. It's not to control food supplies. It's not to control health. It has to incentivize people on the ground to provide those services, right? So that's the role of the state. And the main question you ask is, what should SADC do? And since I said SADC is a group of politicians coordinating from different countries, that's what they must do. They must collaborate on creating an environment in Southern Africa that will allow, as Patrick has been putting it, commercial agriculture, right? Where there is less state interventions, where agriculture becomes business, right? There should be competition. People should produce what they can produce. That's the main thing that has to be done. That's the approach that the SADC has to take. Remember, when you look at Africa as a whole, especially sub-Saharan Africa, when you look at the Heritage Index of Economic Freedom, I'm sure, Ibrahim, you look at it often, you will see that at the bottom of it, it's us Africans, right? In terms of the levels of openness, in terms of markets, some of Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom. And that's a shame, right? It basically means that we are following wrong policies. Those policies are the exact policies that are repressing agriculture, are the exact policies that are not allowing the healthcare sector to flourish, right? The public health care in South Africa, it's not good, right? It's not good. As a result, we have people accessing, the poor people will access the public health sector, and those who are well off will have quality healthcare in the private sector. So we are seeing those levels of inequality taking place. So for me, I think the main thing that the SADC has to do is to collaborate on policies and push for policies that will promote markets, that will promote the private sector. In fact, your second question was around what should the private sector, what is the role of the private sector. The private sector can't do much if we have, especially when you look at South Africa, when you look at the past 25 years of our democracy, you'll be shocked that regulations have been rising up, and up, Ibrahim. And when you look at that those rising regulations, regulating the private sector, you see that unemployment, shockingly, has been rising. You mentioned the number of people who are poor right now. I can tell you, unemployment rate has been rising. Under Jacob Zuma, rose even is still rising under the current president. We are seeing plus minus 40% of unemployment now, right? Which is quite shocking. The youth, us young people, we account for plus minus 75% of that unemployment. Why? Because of repressive kind of economic policies. And South Africa has been doing terribly in terms of the Heritage Foundation's index of economic freedom. We've been dropping because of policies that are not really promoting the private sector. So for me, really, our politicians, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Zimbabwe, or across the whole Southern Africa, as SADC or any other kind of bodies, we have to create an environment that will incentivize people to be innovative, for people to contribute, for people to compete in every kind of industry, whether it is food supplies and whether it is healthcare, wherever it may be. There has to be competition taking place. We've seen in South Africa what lack of competition has done when you look at data, data network prices. It's been accessing internet in South Africa has been quite expensive, my man. It's been bad, even by when you compare to emerging markets. It's been terrible. So that's because when I researched about this, I found that it's mainly because of lack of competition, right? We have a few companies that are in space, and many of the people, they are being pushed back by the levels of regulations in terms of being able to enter the market. So government must guarantee or make sure that it creates an environment where it's easy for everybody to get into the market in every industry and be able to produce what they can produce at lower prices. As a result, we are going to cut the high levels of unemployment we are seeing right now. We're also going to address the issues of shortage of food in the African continent, and we're also going to address the issues of healthcare. Right now, the fact that we have this healthcare that's been mismanaged the way it has been, it's catching up with us now with respect to this COVID-19. Right. So, I mean, we've been doing wrong policies, and statistics and data, no matter how we look at them, they do show that we have been doing things wrong, and we have to do things right. And doing things right means that there has to be minimal a role of the state in our economy.
We have a question from one of our audience from Kenya, Morog, and they say, in the face of the fact that most of African economic players, or at least in my country, Kenya, are in the informal sector, how effective are these lockdowns measures likely to be without risking food crisis? And I want Mr. Tyrus to help us kindly answer that. So this person is asking about the lockdowns in Kenya and how are we going to make sure, considering the situation of food distribution in Kenya, how are we going to make sure this lockdown do not in fact affect, people when it comes to, getting food for their families or, saving enough for as long as the lockdown persists?
I completely relate to the question because majority of the population, especially in the capital and most of these large cities, is the informal sector. So you have people who live hand to mouth, probably making between $8 to $10 a day, maybe $50 on a good day, and they have no other source of income. And with the lockdowns and over and above the lockdowns, we also have the curfews that have been imposed. So which means most people make their money after people have left work. But now we're in two scenarios. So people are not going to work. And number two, the government has outlawed movement from 7 p.m. So which means these people are not making anything, so to speak. And this is one of the sectors that is going to be really hard hit. And I'm really not sure how it will recover within the next couple of months. And unless there's a very robust fiscal stimulus program that the government is willing to inject into this sector in the form of, just giving them subsidies in terms of their raw materials, maybe giving them tax breaks, which again is also a catch-22 because that's a very heavily untaxed sector. So they don't have any tax records, they don't know how much revenue they're collecting, and you can only deal with estimates. So the government really, this will really be the test of our government to see how serious and how committed it is in ensuring that its economy, which is comprised of probably 30 to 40% of the GDP, does not crumble, because these are the people who hold the country together, basically. And in a struggling economy as ours, I've not heard anything to that effect. Maybe in the coming weeks we'll hear what it is that the government is willing to do, because lowering the VAT is not enough. It doesn't give us, it doesn't lend credence to the commitment that the government should be doing for someone who's making less than $1 a day. And then again, because this also has a trickle-down effect. When people can't eat, then the state goes into a state of anarchy. You have people rioting, there'll be a shortage of food. We've not seen any programs that are being put in place to supply people with food. There is no relief program that has been put in place. So quite frankly, I'm also very keen to see how this plays out, but I can only hope and pray that we have brilliant minds in the Ministry of Trade and Finance, and that they are really crunching these numbers and trying to see how it is that they can salvage the situation, which I'm very sure replicates across of Africa.
The U.S. government recently came out when it came apparent that coronavirus is going to last for a while, and warned people that cyber attacks is going to increase at this moment, because of course people know, the cyber criminals know people are going to be home, they're going to be using online platforms, so they're going to be more vulnerable to cyber attacks. We haven't seen I haven't really seen any African government reiterate that fact to a lot of Africans. The first question, how can African governments, address these cyber problems, or are they even doing enough, or can the private sector play a role? And the second question is, how can Africans, get integrated into global technological system without, experiencing any of the problems we experienced on this platform about 30 minutes ago?
The use of the internet, right, and indeed technology as a whole has, in my opinion, unlocked a lot of things when it comes to development of Africa. Not least, in my opinion, is the reverse of the over-centralization of political power, which then has given citizens an opportunity to actively participate in governance in a number of countries. Now that serves two purposes. One is an advantage for democratization and getting active citizenship through various civic tech tools and getting citizens to connect, which bypasses in certain cases a lot of the bottlenecks that exist in our private lives, whether we're doing business, whether it's about regulations, whether it's about how we're engaging our governments, whether it's a demand for accountability. It almost offsets everything. If you are a government official, you like a part of that. The part of that that you are excited about is the part that drives economic development. So the part that B2Bs are connecting, the part that is unlocking some side of the economy that you don't like. And in the case of Ghana, and I'm sure Kenya and some other places where you've seen mobile money explosion and the utilization and development of different, businesses off of the internet, that has meant additional taxes for government. And so you like that. The part you don't like, which is citizens' ability to demand accountability from you, citizens' ability to actively participate and demand solutions to problems like COVID-19. That part you don't like. And so you end up using the existing regulatory systems to clamp down on them. Here's how it gets interesting. So you find citizens who become all of a sudden very ingenious and decide to almost hijack state machinery on the internet. They hijack that. And I've seen in this country, people take up websites of ministries, for example. They hijack them completely. And so the threat for security is real. But what it means, given the two issues I've talked about, is that African governments have to recognize it as an opportunity, even in the area of governance and accountability, not only in the private generation of wealth. So that if they do, then they ought to be working coherently with private actors to finding solutions to dealing with people who, so to speak, will be undertaking unsavory activities like what we have just seen. As I sit here, I'm wondering whether my government's position on usurpation of my data from telecom service providers and things like that does not have ramifications on my ability to move around or my ability to undertake any kind of economic activity. Now, if I'm thinking about that, I'm already thinking about mechanisms and measures by which I bypass that. And so the threat of security, I think, is very real. We've seen lots of money that has been lost, for example, on financial transactions because of illicit activities of all kinds of people that we find on the internet. And that has almost undermined a lot of activities that have been put together. And so on a regional level, I would argue that we live in an era where sharing of common platforms, sharing of information is almost important for the management of the internet and for the protection of the security of citizens in this age. We're talking education technology now. A lot of our education materials are going to move online. I don't understand why we haven't been able to navigate that curve in Africa, because my opinion is that our curve is much steeper. It's not as shallow as other markets that you expect to have 100 years or 50 years of development before you can navigate that. We don't have that. We are the people who lack physical infrastructure, schools in terms of healthcare facilities. And so if you have emerging tools that provides the connections for the provision of these services, it's important that we think coherently through how those services can be democratized without necessarily thinking that we have to stifle it, because it is the attempt to stifle, it is the attempt to protect, it is the attempt to concentrate, it is the attempt to usurp that creates an incentive for people to want to operate out of the system, which then makes it very difficult. So I think that we are at a point where the government might recognize the private sector as active players and active participants. The government can mobilize it, even if we go globally. If we go globally, the global governments, the United Nations, they can't deal with it alone. You're talking systems right now where some technology companies have as much as 2 billion users. I don't see any country that's 2 billion. I don't see any country that's 2 billion in population. What that means is, if you have to understand how to combat and deal with cybersecurity, you need to recognize that they have an active role to play. And the role they have to play shouldn't be the state coming around with whip to beat everybody else, but let them recognize that they are part of the ecosystem of solutions that need to be deployed. And so that, for me, is the most important thing. And why we in Africa have been caught behind the 8 ball in terms of technology development is because we don't provide the incentives for technological innovation in Africa. We don't. And so you may have a bunch of young men, young women on the streets of Lagos or young men on the streets of Accra who are developing different innovative solutions that are resolving problems that are very localized, instead of providing the ecosystem by which they operate so they can develop and find local solutions to problems. We don't. And that kind of thinking, which we have in other traditional value chains of the African economy, we have imported into the evolution of technology. And so even when I start hearing things like Africa needs to leapfrog in terms of its adoption of technology. How do we protect data systems? How do we ensure that our private and personal data is accurately protected? No. Most of the technology on the African continent today is hosted in Europe. It's hosted in South America. It's going to be hosted in places in the US. So when do we arrive at the point where we recognize that, look, whether it is the African Union, whether it is SADC, whether it is the EAC, whether it is ECOWAS, whether it's the Maghreb region, you appreciate that we are in an era where technology and innovation, particularly the use of the World Wide Web, the use of internet infrastructure, is going to be one of the most defining activities that Africa must have its stake today. How many of our countries and our governments and government officials don't you find using Yahoo Mail to send official email? How many of them don't you find?
Of course, they use
there
it.
are lots of examples, right? There are lots, and these are where the threats and exposures exist. So I think that if we are to learn anything at all, there's been sufficient data points in terms of information breaches, in terms of people who want to undertake unsavory activities online and by use of technology. We've seen applications in areas like recruitment for, very negative institutions, if I can say that, like what you've seen for Al Qaeda, what you've seen, for Al Shabaab and the rest of them. They've found a way of using technology, and these are all putting security threats. So I'm saying, let's not look at technology as an isolated case. What we are seeing in technology in Africa now catching up is as a result of policies that I would say do not recognize the true potential of what technology can do in transforming what we have in Africa.
So what do you think about the growing security threat in Africa, and especially concerning, safety of, internet users, and of course, how Africa can potentially get integrated safely into the global tech space?
One of the things that I can appreciate is that countries have started, realizing that it can no longer be ignored, and cybersecurity now has become, a matter of national security as well, because we've seen in other first world countries, we've had state actors attacking different nations. We've seen that in Eastern Europe, especially, governments attacking other governments through cybersecurity, taking down power plants and all things like that. Africa is one of the continents that leapfrogged the technology growth, because we jumped right from zero technology to mobile money, where everyone has a smartphone and we have internet. And I think we missed a few lessons and a couple of decades of learning that most of these other developed countries went through. And one of the things that I can say is that most governments are realizing that cybersecurity is something that they need to start taking seriously. And I can say, from the country where I come from, Kenya, we came up with a national cybersecurity master plan, which I was very privileged to have worked with help from Booz Allen and Hamilton in the US. And now this has continuously been translated for the last 8 years into some action, where the government currently is training fresh graduates from the university. Purely, it has started a pure cybersecurity hub where they're getting trained, and after they get trained, they are promised of employment. Because one of the things you need to first do is recognize that there's a skill gap. So you need to build capacity to handle all these opportunities and all these challenges that are coming up with as far as cybersecurity is concerned. Secondly, I can say that with the proliferation of technology, and especially with mobile money, we've seen rising cases of fraud. And right now, I can confidently say that within this period of time, I'd like to see the statistics of how many people in their homes got attacked because they don't have the know-how of how to securely work from home. They don't have the training, they don't have the know-how, they've not been empowered by their companies on how to securely work from home. Because if I tell someone what you need to do is set up a VPN, first and foremost, what is a VPN? You need to train your citizens to do that. And so we'll find a lot of data leakages, we'll find a lot of identity theft, which I think is spanning across Africa. And we're seeing a lot of ransomware as well, where people just hold your data at ransom and you need to pay by Bitcoin. And I think there's a big challenge. And again, the windfall of cyber attacks is just about to come. I can confidently say that with the trends that have been happening across the board, I can say that there's something that is coming up, and there are very few nations that are ready for what is happening. Same way we were not ready for COVID-19. It's a black swan event. I think it's the same way that, in as far as cybersecurity is concerned, and as Patrick has rightfully put it, we have governments who are still running Yahoo. We have governments who, and if you look at it, if you've looked at the news, you'll find that some of the government websites are easily hacked into by 14-year-olds from Indonesia or from Asia. So which means, and the people who are manning these technologies are people in their 70s and 80s who don't want to relinquish. And I think it's a problem with Africans. We really love power and we don't like stepping down. And this is a price we pay for, but now it's going to be a huge price because we get connected. Our power grids are getting connected. Our health systems are getting connected. The other day, our government connected to Wuhan in China so that they can assist them in diagnosing this particular pandemic. So who's going to secure all that? So I think there's a big challenge, just like any other challenge that you have in Africa. But my confidence is that if governments can start doing the right thing, start with homegrown solutions. We don't always have to look to Israel. We don't need to look to the US. Let's start with our homegrown solutions because no one understands African problems better than we ourselves.
Because you're one of the advocates of, personal solution or individual solution, non-governmental solutions to problems. So in this case, what is your non-governmental solution to all this crisis in Africa?
Non-governmental solution. I like it. It's a nice way of putting it. I think we need to recognize and to come to terms, as we've always been as Africans, and that is, we to take care of each other, right? Be nice to other people, assist wherever you can. I'm not saying that get close to them because now, with COVID-19, you need to distance yourself. We call it social distancing these days. So, but be helpful to other people. Share information. If there's something you've heard about the virus or anything, share that information with people around you. You could share it through telephone calls or any kind of electronic platforms or whatever, but share information with other people. And also, we as citizens, let's make sure that when these issues of this kind, whether it's security, whether it's disease or a pandemic, we should make sure that we hold our politicians to account. Question them. Right? Don't be scared to speak up. Criticize them. Criticize their policy. Criticize their response to the pandemic. Speak up. I think that's very important. It's very important that we get that right as Africans, because over decades, many of us didn't have that opportunity, and many of us still don't. But wherever it's possible, let's speak up and hold our politicians accountable and share knowledge and information with each other. I think that's very important.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Phumlani, and thank you very much everybody for joining us. And that wraps up this month's webinar.